I used to think that I was just bad at describing wine. I thought maybe my taste buds are broken. But here's the truth. Most people literally cannot taste what they cannot name. Change your words, change your world. But the same labels that guide your brain can also quietly blindfold it. Today we are diving into how language shapes your mind, sometimes by restricting it and sometimes by expanding it. So let's go. Hi there, I'm Yvette. I'm a neuroscientist and an author of several neuroscience studies. On this channel, I like to break down how the brain works, decode its mysteries, and explore the deeper questions that they raise about our future. So if this sounds right up your alley, well, you know what to do. In George Orwell's novel 1984, the regime restricts dissent by systematically destroying their language's vocabulary. Orwell suggests that by forcing the next generation to learn this limited vocabulary, citizens would eventually just be unable to voice dissent. Actually, they would be even unable to think in those terms without the words to frame such concepts. And this is not very far from the truth, because it turns out that what you can name becomes easier to notice, and what you cannot name becomes easier to miss. For example, in Russian, there are distinct words for light blue and dark blue. Initially, it is whoa, nothing special. However, it was shown that in the study, Russian speakers were typically faster at telling these shades apart, especially when the shades were very close to the boundary in question. And this phenomenon is not just restricted to Russian, but also to other languages who have this distinct definition, such as, for example, Greek. So, and if you're not sold on this idea, no props, because interestingly, if you block verbal processing, the advantage shrinks as seen, for example, in this study. So it really has something to do with their language skills. So yeah, language acts like a filter. Think about it. Eskimos have 40 different words for snow to describe the different subtleties. In Malta, we only have one, and we often use the English one instead. Because for us, snow is snow. There is only one kind, the kind that we don't get. But yeah, joking aside, filters have a cost. When you describe a complex face in words, you bias your memory towards a coarse verbal code. Later, when you try to recognize the face, you often do worse. Psychologists call this verbal overshadowing. You can think of it also in terms of a computer storing an image is bigger in terms of storage space needed, but has much more information than if, let's say, you had to describe it in words and save it as a text file. Similarly with your brain. So, language can spotlight, but it can also blur our memories. For example, last time I was playing a memory game. The other player flipped a card. I looked at it, and at the same time he named it. Later on, I flipped the same card expecting to find the card he named. It turned out that it was completely wrong. So even though I had seen the card, what my brain registered was the verbal labeling, which overwrote what I had just seen. So if this teaches us something, other than I have a bad brain, it is that brain uses some shortcuts when it comes to language. So in general, try to avoid early labeling when precision matters. However, use it abundantly when you want speed, such as searching, categorizing, or also teaching others, I guess. Recently, I was watching this movie called Arrival, which incidentally also inspired this video. But anyway, the movie revolves around the idea that learning an alien language changes the protagonist's experience of time itself. And mind you, this is fiction, but it captures something true. New language can rewire the way our brain predicts and plans. For example, learning to read music does not just help you with songs, it literally changes how you think. So let's take some real-world examples. For example, like futureless languages. In the study, it was shown that when people speak a language that does not have a future tense, like in some Asian languages, they are more likely to engage in behavior that would benefit the long term than people who speak languages with a future tense, such as, for example, English. This can be speculated that when a speaker is talking using a futureless language, the mindset is that the future is one with the present, whereas when there is a future tense, the speaker is thinking in terms that the future is separate from the now, and therefore it is less personal. Then there are gestures as a way of thought. We all know Italians and their gestures. Well, it turns out that gestures aren't just a quirky add-on. In the study, for example, students who gesture while explaining math were more likely to retain the concepts. Well, in other words, the hands are not just used for expression, but they somewhat help in creating thoughts. So when you encounter Mediterranean talking, well, you know what is happening here, huh? And then another example would be bilingual frame switching. So different languages have different structures and follow different grammar rules, as we've already established. And this can be translated into behavior. For example, when I talk in Maltese, which comes from the Arabic language family, in a sentence the most important word is the verb, because from it I can infer who is speaking, who it is referring to, and what the action is. So colloquially, can easily say just the verb, and it would totally make sense for the other person. I find it very flexible. Well, maybe a Maltese linguist will contradict me on this, but yeah, I don't know. However, when it comes to German, oh man, the thinking process is totally different. One has to know exactly what you are going to say at the beginning of every sentence. And you cannot come up with it as you go along, as I usually do in Maltese or English. So, who knows? Maybe the German stereotype of orderliness and rule-loving has some roots in its language. Food for thought. So yeah, tools shape thoughts, and thoughts reshape reality. But language is not just about the perception or the problem solving. It is also about the words we use on ourselves, especially when it comes to our emotions. So, why do some people fall apart under stress while others stay steady? Sometimes the difference is vocabulary. A couple of years ago, I was reading this book, which is called Why Has Nobody Told Me This Before?, which is by Dr. Julie Smith. And one thing that struck me the most was that one useful tool to alleviate the symptoms of anxiety and depression is to name the feeling in detail. This is because when you label an emotion like angry, disappointed, resentful, your prefrontal cortex steps in and calms activity in your amygdala. And in fact, people who use more precise emotion vocabularies, what psychologists call emotional granularity, tend to cope better and ruminate less. Labels create handles for regulation, as precision creates calm, because also precision clears out the clutter in the mind. We have all heard of Jordan Peterson. Love him or hate him, up to you, but sometimes he does give out nuggets of truth, one of which is to be precisely articulate. And this is important for you to understand where you are and where you want to go. And it is also important for others to understand what you want without room for ambiguity. So when I was in school, I used to complain to my mom why English had to have so many words meaning all the same thing. I remember very clearly asking, why couldn't there be just one word and let's just be done with it? And I guess any one of us who learned a second language had this frustration at some point or another. However, having the tools to express yourself and to think is a very important skill. Unfortunately, in this day and age, it is very easy for us to bypass learning, as technology has made it pretty easy for us to bypass. And mind you, sometimes it is quite essential. You don't need to stay playing around with a wooden stick to start a fire when you have a lighter in your pocket. But for sure, preserving language and the use of it is very much in our own very interest to preserve. Because after all, critical thinking is depending on it, as you can see in the study over here. And talking about critical thinking, if you find any of the papers that I mentioned today quite interesting, please feel free to go through them and read the actual papers. I put a link in the description down below, so it's free for you to access. And if you are intimidated by medical papers, however you would like to improve the skill, well, I have put something together which is a simple system to help you do that. I am also updating it along based on your requests. So yeah, language is not a prison, but I do believe that it can put us in a mental one if not properly wielded. But as always, awareness of its effects on our brain is always the first step. However, now that we're here, now knowing what you know, I wonder, how was language impacting you without you even noticing?